With the advance of the German army eastward, a phase of the conflict began that was not fought in trenches or battlefields. In occupied towns, remote ravines and backyards, thousands of people were gathered in silence and executed without trial or witnesses. It was the beginning of a method that would soon become the norm. The Einsatzgruppen, formed by members of the SS and the police, were in charge of applying this new form of warfare. They moved behind the front, followed simple orders, and acted with a regularity that defied all logic. In their wake, the numbers grew and the places were marked forever. What made these executions the most brutal of the Nazi regime? Where did these massacres occur, and why did they become the most used method by the Nazis? Kamianets-Podilskyi, the first mass execution by bullet. In the fields of western Ukraine, where German forces were advancing during the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, a precedent was established that would mark the evolution of Nazi genocide. The city of Kamianets-Podilskyi had fallen under Wehrmacht control on July 11, 1941, immediately becoming an operations zone for Einsatzgruppe C. Friedrich Jeckeln, higher SS and police leader for southern Russia, received specific orders during a meeting held on August 23, 1941 in Lidice. The instructions came directly from the Reichssicherheitshauptamt under the authority of Reinhard Heydrich and Heinrich Himmler. The objective was to completely eliminate the concentration of Jews that had formed in Kamianets-Podilskyi, composed of two distinct groups, the local Ukrainian residents and the Hungarian deportees who had been stripped of their citizenship and handed over to German authorities. The operation required a specific pyramidal command structure for this first systematic massacre. Jeckeln established Sonderkommando 11B, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Paul Blobel as the direct executing unit. This specialized force consisted of between 80 and 100 men specifically trained in mass murders. Police Battalion 320 formed the outer perimeter and provided logistical security. Additional elements of the German army facilitated transportation and the resources necessary for the operation. Preparations began immediately after authorization from Lidice. The victims, who had been previously concentrated in improvised barracks within the city, were organized for their transfer. The Hungarian deportees, many coming from the Transcarpathian region, had remained for weeks in deplorable conditions, without regular access to food or basic sanitation. This situation facilitated the German justification for their immediate elimination, alleging logistical and sanitary problems. German authorities prepared the execution site using natural and artificial pits in the surroundings of Kamianets-Podilskyi. They took advantage of old artillery craters and anti-tank ditches excavated during the Soviet retreat, which significantly reduced the time and resources necessary to create mass burial sites. The use of these existing structures demonstrated the meticulous planning of the operation and established a model of terrain utilization that would be replicated later. The transport of victims was carried out through columns on foot under strict armed surveillance. German forces established a security perimeter of several kilometers, ensuring that no person could enter or leave the zone during the 3 days of operation duration. This measure guaranteed both total control of the area and the secrecy of the operation from external observers. The execution procedure followed a systematic protocol that would be repeated identically throughout the entire operation, establishing the first standardized model of mass extermination by shooting. Victims were lined up in groups in front of the prepared pits. Depending on the specific terrain, they were forced to kneel or remain standing at the edge of the excavations. Members of Sonderkommando 11B fired at close range, concentrating their shots on the nape or the back of the skull using Luger pistols or Mauser rifles according to the tactical circumstances of the moment. The bodies fell directly into the common graves. In cases where victims did not die immediately from the shots, they were thrown alive into the excavations to accelerate the process. Each pit was covered with earth immediately after each round of executions, eliminating visual traces and containing any movement of people who had survived the initial shots. The operation functioned in organized shifts that maximized the efficiency of extermination. Internal logistical estimates from the Sonderkommando indicate an execution capacity of between 300 and 500 people per hour, depending on the size of each group and the efficiency of fire. The entire process was manual and developed completely outdoors, without using gas vehicles or closed installations. The simplicity of the method allowed maintaining a constant pace during complete workdays. German personnel rotated in shifts to avoid fatigue that could reduce operational efficiency. Programmed breaks were established for executing units while others continued the process, guaranteeing continuous flow of elimination. Commanders personally supervised to ensure that speed standards were maintained and that there was no waste of ammunition. According to the report from Einsatzgruppen dated September 11, 1941, the total number of people executed in Kamianets-Podilskyi reached 23,600. This figure was confirmed through internal SS documents and reports from Police Battalion 320, materials that are preserved in the German Bundesarchiv archives and have been used as evidence in multiple academic investigations and subsequent judicial processes. The specific distribution of victims was documented with characteristic Nazi administrative precision. Approximately 16,000 corresponded to deported Hungarian Jews, while about 7,600 were local Ukrainian Jews. This differentiation demonstrated the international nature of the operation, combining deportations from Allied countries with elimination of local populations in a single coordinated operation. Subsequent investigations by the Soviet Extraordinary State Committee, carried out between 1944 and 1945, confirmed these figures through partial exhumations, forensic analyses, and topographical measurements of the execution sites. Soviet investigators documented the disposition of bodies, ballistic evidence, and burial conditions, providing independent validation of German records. The documents that support this massacre include the official report from Einsatzgruppen preserved in the German Federal Archives under reference Barch R 58/214, the operational reports from Sonderkommando 11B with detailed lists of ammunition spent and casualty reports, and the records from Police Battalion 320 used during the Nuremberg trials. Additionally, communications between Jeckeln and the Wehrmacht High Command regarding the use of transport resources and allocation of operational spaces are preserved. Soviet aerial photographs of the pits taken in 1944 during the reoccupation of the zone provide visual evidence of the scope of the operation. These images show the terrain disturbance and the exact location of the common graves, allowing correlation of administrative reports with physical evidence from the site. Hungarian records about the deportation of their stateless citizens evidence direct collaboration between Budapest and Berlin in the process that led to these mass executions. These documents include lists of deportees, expulsion orders, and diplomatic correspondence that demonstrates international coordination in the implementation of genocide. The Kamianets-Podilskyi massacre established an operational model that would be repeated in occupied territories along the Eastern Front. The methodology employed, isolation of victims, controlled transport, systematic alignment, direct shooting, and immediate burial, became a standard protocol for the murder of entire communities that would characterize the Holocaust by bullets throughout Eastern Europe. The facts were meticulously documented by their own perpetrators, reflecting a deliberate and perfectly organized execution that placed this operation as one of the clearest examples of administrative murder in the history of Nazi genocide. This obsessive documentation would become a distinctive characteristic of all subsequent Nazi extermination operations. Babin Yar, the Ravine of Blood. On the outskirts of Kiev, a natural ravine of more than 2.5 kilometers in length became the scene of one of the most efficiently organized extermination operations during the initial phase of the implementation of the final solution. In the course of approximately 36 hours between September 29th and 30th, 1941, units of Einsatzgruppen executed 33,171 people in an operation that demonstrated the technical and logistical evolution of Nazi mass murder methods. Kiev had fallen into Wehrmacht hands on September 19, 1941, after the largest military encirclement recorded in modern history. In that operation, more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were surrounded and captured. Barely 10 days after the occupation of the city, German high commands implemented a decision that had been planned as an integral part of the administration of conquered territories within the framework of the racial war against the Soviet Union. The decision to exterminate the Jewish population of Kiev was made during a meeting organized by Kurt Eberhard, military governor of the city. Participants included Otto Rasch, commander of Einsatzgruppe C, Paul Blobel, chief of Sonderkommando 4A, and Friedrich Jeckeln, higher SS and police leader, who contributed the experience acquired in Kamianets-Podilskyi. This command structure combined occupation military authority with specialized security units, guaranteeing both the logistical resources and the technical expertise necessary for the operation. On September 28th, official notices printed in Russian, Ukrainian, and German were distributed throughout the occupied city. The posters ordered all Jews of Kiev to present themselves with their documents, valuables, and clothing at the intersection of Melnikova and Doktorivska streets. The deception was deliberate and systematic. The relocation of the Jewish population to other territories was promised, concealing the true intentions of total extermination. Logistical planning encompassed not only the transport and containment of victims, but also the preparation of the execution site and post-operation cleanup procedures. Participating units included Sonderkommando 4A of Einsatzgruppe C, Police Battalions 45 and 303, and contingents of the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police under direct SS control. The chain of command operated on three clearly defined levels: administrative under Eberhard, operational under Blobel, and execution by field troops, all supervised by the RSHA and the Superior Command of Army Group South. Babin Yar was selected for its specific geographical characteristics that made it an ideal site for mass executions. The ravine presented a variable depth between 10 and 50 meters, with natural slopes that facilitated control of victims and immediate concealment of corpses. Its structure eliminated the need for extensive excavations and provided a controlled environment for mass executions. The natural topography of the site allowed organizing a continuous flow of victims without visual interference from surrounding areas. The procedure followed an established sequence that remained constant throughout the entire operation, perfecting the methods developed in Kamianets-Podilskyi. Victims were escorted from the gathering point to the edge of the ravine through organized columns under strict military surveillance. Upon arriving at the site, they were forced to undress completely and deposit their belongings in piles, classified by size and type of object. This organization facilitated both crowd control and the subsequent recovery of valuables by German authorities. Groups of victims, composed of between 10 and 30 people according to the conditions of the moment, were led to the edge of the precipice. Executions were carried out using Massacre 98K rifles for precision at medium distance, Luger P-08, and Walter P-38 pistols for short-range shots, and MG-34 machine guns used according to specific tactical circumstances. Shots were concentrated on the nape to guarantee immediate death and minimize body movement when falling. Corpses fell directly into the ravine, accumulating in successive layers. In cases where some victims survived the initial discharge, they were finished off with additional shots or buried alive under subsequent waves of bodies. Layers of quicklime and earth were thrown intermittently to disguise the corpses and control odors before continuing with the next series of executions. This process allowed maintaining a continuous rhythm without significant interruptions. The operation functioned 24 hours a day to maximize efficiency within the established time frame. Subsequent documents indicate an average execution rate of approximately 1,000 victims per hour, maintained through rotating shifts of participating units. The use of artificial lighting during nighttime hours allowed continuing executions without pause, maximizing operational efficiency and completing the elimination of the entire Jewish population of Kiev in the shortest possible time. The participating personnel was estimated between 300 and 500 individuals, including between 70 and 90 members of Sonderkommando 4A, between 150 and 200 German police from battalions 45 and 303, and more than 100 Ukrainian auxiliaries used for containment and transport tasks. The armament employed included Mauser rifles for precision executions, Luger and Walter pistols for close-range shots, MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns for large groups, and Opel Blitz trucks for transport of victims and equipment. The Ukrainian auxiliary police performed specific tactical functions: maintenance of perimeter control, escort of victims, prevention of escapes during the journey, and participation in the burial of bodies. These collaborators acted under direct pressure from occupation authorities, although some were part of nationalist structures previously integrated into the Nazi administrative apparatus. There are no official records of spontaneous civilian participation in the executions. The entire operation was controlled exclusively by German commands. Logistical coordination required continuous supply of ammunition, fuel for vehicles, excavation tools, and materials to cover the pits. German supply services organized temporary deposits near the site to avoid interruptions in the extermination process. First aid posts were also established for executing personnel in case of firearm accidents. According to the operational report dated October 2, 1941, signed by Paul Blobel and transmitted to the RSHA, the precise figure of 171 executed victims was established. This figure has been validated through internal German documents and was officially accepted in the Nuremberg trials. The report was recovered in 1945 from the RSHA archives in Berlin and used as primary evidence in the process against the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen held between 1947 and 1948. The documents that support the Babin Yar operation include the activity report from Sonderkommando 4A that explicitly mentions the victim count, correspondence between Paul Blobel and the RSHA preserved in the Nuremberg archives, operational reports from Police Battalions 45 and 303 with detailed schedules, ammunition used and shift assignments, and Wehrmacht military maps showing the security perimeter, access routes, control points, and unit distribution. Karl Jaeger's report, although referring to other zones of operation in the Baltic countries, confirms that the type of operation applied in Babin Yar corresponded to a standardized policy implemented throughout Ukraine during 1941. These documents have been cross-referenced by specialized historians such as Karol C. Berkhoff, Timothy Snyder, and Yitzhak Arad, who agree on the authenticity of the sources and the precision of the figures presented. The Babin Yar operation also included subsequent concealment measures. In 1943, when Soviet troops began approaching Kiev, the Germans organized Operation Sonderkommando 1005, directed by the same Paul Blobel, to exhume and burn the bodies with the objective of eliminating evidence of the crime. However, the magnitude of the original operation made it impossible to completely erase the traces of genocide. The Babin Yar massacre represented the technical culmination of mass execution methods developed by German special units during the first months of the Soviet invasion. The combination of systematic deception, utilization of natural geographical characteristics, coordination between multiple units, and meticulous documentation established a model that would be replicated in subsequent operations along the Eastern Front. The operation demonstrated the capacity of the Nazi apparatus to execute genocides on a massive scale using direct methods and relatively limited resources, prefiguring the industrial methods that would be implemented later in extermination camps. Mauthausen, the Parachutist's Wall. In the hills of Austria near Linz, the Mauthausen concentration camp developed specific execution methods that combined forced labor with systematic murder. The Wiener Graben granite quarry became an instrument of extermination through a procedure known by SS guards as the Parachutist's Wall, an escarpment between 30 and 40 meters high that was systematically used for executions disguised as work accidents or suicides. The Mauthausen camp operated as an extermination center through forced labor since its establishment in 1938. Differentiating itself from other camps by its initial classification as a Grade 3 installation destined for incorrigible political enemies of the Reich. The quarry formed an integral part of the death by physical exhaustion system, but its stepped structure on multiple levels provided the SS with an additional elimination method that complemented the camp's regular procedures. Victims of the Parachutist's Wall were led to the top of the escarpment and forced to jump under direct threat of firearms or through deliberate pushes executed by guards. This method was distinguished from other execution systems employed in concentration camps by its apparent spontaneity and the possibility of recording deaths as work accidents instead of formal executions. The procedure was ordered directly by SS officers who selected prisoners according to specific criteria: disciplinary punishments for real or imaginary infractions, reprisals for detected or suspected resistance activities, or simply as an instrument of psychological terror to maintain control over the camp's general population. Executions were frequently carried out outside the visual reach of most prisoners, although some episodes were deliberately executed in view of the rest of the camp as a form of exemplary punishment. Victims who fell from the wall impacted against the granite rocks at the base of the quarry, generally dying from the impact trauma or from multiple injuries that caused death within minutes. In cases where the prisoner survived the initial fall, SS guards would finish him off with pistol shots or let him die from suffered injuries without providing medical assistance. This method allowed officers to register deaths as work accidents, avoiding formal execution reports that could attract unwanted administrative attention. Internal camp records include multiple references to this method in Sicherheitsdienst reports, SS administrative documents in Mauthausen, and subsequent declarations from officers judged in the Dachau processes. August Eigruber, Gauleiter of Upper Austria, confirmed during war crimes trials that the jumps were officially authorized and were not considered formal executions, but military discipline measures and order maintenance within the penitentiary system. The Mauthausen Memorial Archives contain name lists dated between 1941 and 1944, with prisoners designated as unfit for work who subsequently do not appear in transfer records or medical death reports. These documents were used as evidence in American military processes held in Dachau in 1946, where the systematic nature of these executions and their integration into the camp's regular administration was established. Internal orders signed by Franz Ziereis, camp commander until 1945, are preserved, where the use of exemplary punishments and informal executions without notification to the Reich Interior Ministry was regulated. These directives demonstrate that the use of the wall as an elimination method was known and approved by the camp's administrative hierarchy, constituting part of the official policy of terror and control. The use of the Parachutist's wall served a double operational function within the Mauthausen system. In certain cases, it functioned as a covert elimination method for specific prisoners, creating the appearance of accident or suicide to avoid administrative investigations or external attention. On other occasions, executions were deliberately public and visible to the rest of the prisoners, serving as a tool of deterrence and psychological control. Covert executions were organized outside the general work schedule of the quarry. Only guards specifically selected by officers attended, and they were not officially recorded as executions in the camp's administrative books. This method was frequently applied to resistance members, Soviet officers, Catholic priests, and Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to collaborate with camp administration or renounce their religious convictions. Public executions were carried out in front of groups of prisoners forced to witness the act as part of their work routine. The SS organized mandatory formations with previous speeches about discipline and the consequences of disobedience. These demonstrations were used as a preventive measure to avoid sabotage, escape attempts, or organized resistance acts within the camp. Franz Ziereis, captured by American forces in May 1945, declared under military custody that the wall method was devised as a quick way to eliminate irrecoverable or subversive elements within the penitentiary system. In his confession signed before the Allies, he acknowledged that the practice was habitual for years and that it was known by all camp personnel, from guards to administrative officers. Ziereis indicated that he himself authorized multiple executions through this method under verbal orders transmitted to officers to avoid written traces that could compromise camp administration in case of external investigations. This policy of undocumented orders was characteristic of the Nazi concentration camp system, allowing maintenance of plausible denial before superior authorities. After his testimony, Ziereis died from bullet wounds suffered during his capture, but his declarations were corroborated by other SS commands, including Karl Schulz and Hans-Heinrich Grünberg during subsequent judicial procedures. His statements were contrasted with documents recovered from the camp archive and personal notes found in his office after the liberation of the camp by American forces. Austrian courts after 1945 established specific figures through partial exhumations in the Wiener Graben quarry, declarations from surviving camp personnel and crematorium records that evidenced increases in incinerations after episodes of mass executions. A 1946 report from the Austrian Interior Ministry estimated between 350 and 400 documented or deducible executions by fall in the quarry, not including covert cases without direct evidence. Soviet investigation commissions that collaborated with the Allies during trials recognized the wall as a habitual murder method and included it in the official report on Nazi war crimes presented in the Nuremberg processes. Soviet authorities catalogued this procedure as an example of systematic brutality employed in German concentration camps to maintain control over prisoner populations. Unlike extermination camps where murders were massive and industrial, executions in Mauthausen through the wall were characterized by their selective but constant nature. The method allowed the SS to eliminate specific individuals without creating official execution records, maintaining the appearance that deaths were the result of dangerous work in the granite quarry. Available documentation demonstrates that the Parachutists' wall operated as a systematic instrument of terror and elimination throughout the entire existence of the camp. Its use combined practical efficiency with psychological effects on the general prisoner population, establishing a model of control through constant threat of arbitrary execution that would be maintained until the liberation of the camp by American forces in May 1945. The legacy of the Parachutists' wall illustrates the sinister creativity of the Nazi camp system to develop murder methods that could be administratively concealed while serving multiple operational purposes: elimination of problematic individuals, psychological control of the prisoner population, and maintenance of plausible denial before authorities external to the camp system. Lviv, the brutal human hunts. During the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the city of Lviv became the scene of systematic elimination operations that German forces internally called cleaning actions. The Wehrmacht occupied the city on June 30, 1941, barely a week after the beginning of the invasion of the Soviet Union. The rapid retreat of the Red Army had left an administrative vacuum that was immediately exploited by German special units to implement previously planned extermination protocols. The operations did not constitute spontaneous pogroms by the civilian population, but militarized actions executed under a chain of command defined by the Reichssicherheitshauptamt through Einsatzgruppe C. Operational instructions specified the elimination of all potentially dangerous elements in the rear of the front, a category that included Soviet officials, Jewish males of military age, intellectuals, and members of the Communist Party. The commands that directly participated in these operations included Sonderkommando 4B, dependent on Einsatzgruppe C, Police Battalion 304 of the Ordnungspolizei, Sicherheitsdienst units and SS administrative personnel, and support elements of the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police under German tactical supervision. This structure combined units specialized in assassinations with regular police forces and local collaborators who knew the urban geography and the target population. The operations followed a standardized sequence that was repeated daily during the pacification period of the city. The process began with the identification and gathering of targets through suspect lists distributed among Sicherheitsdienst units. These lists mainly included Soviet officials, Jewish males of military age, intellectuals, and members of the Communist Party, all pre-identified before the occupation of the city. Gathering points were established near abandoned schools, Soviet military barracks, and railway stations that provided ample spaces to organize large groups of detainees. Victims were summoned through deceptions such as document registration or work relocation, taking advantage of the administrative confusion following occupation and the collapse of Soviet governmental structures. Once gathered, victims were grouped by tens under armed escort from Sonderkommando Lviv, the brutal human hunts. During the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the city of Lviv became the scene of systematic elimination operations that German forces internally called cleaning actions. The Wehrmacht occupied the city on June 30, 1941, barely a week after the beginning of the invasion of the Soviet Union. The rapid retreat of the Red Army had left an administrative vacuum that was immediately exploited by German special units to implement previously planned extermination protocols. The operations did not constitute spontaneous pogroms by the civilian population, but militarized actions executed under a chain of command defined by the Reichssicherheitshauptamt through Einsatzgruppen. Operational instructions specified the elimination of all potentially dangerous elements in the rear of the front, a category that included Soviet officials, Jewish males of military age, intellectuals, and members of the Communist Party. The commands that directly participated in these operations included Sonderkommando 4B, dependent on Einsatzgruppen, Police Battalion 304 of the Ordnungspolizei, Sicherheitsdienst units and SS administrative personnel, and support elements of the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police under German tactical supervision. This structure combined units specialized in assassinations with regular police forces and local collaborators who knew the urban geography and the target population. The operations followed a standardized sequence that was repeated daily during the pacification period of the city. The process began with the identification and gathering of targets through suspect lists distributed among Sicherheitsdienst units. These lists mainly included Soviet officials, Jewish males of military age, intellectuals and members of the Communist Party, all pre-identified before the occupation of the city. Gathering points were established near abandoned schools, Soviet military barracks and railway stations that provided ample spaces to organize large groups of detainees. Victims were summoned through deceptions such as document registration or work relocation, taking advantage of the administrative confusion following occupation and the collapse of Soviet governmental structures. Once gathered, victims were grouped by tens under armed escort from Sonderkommando 4B. Police Battalion 304 was in charge of patrolling surrounding streets and maintaining security cordons to prevent escapes during the capture and organization process. The Ukrainian Auxiliary Police provided logistical support and local knowledge to identify specific targets that might have evaded initial detection. Transport to execution sites was carried out exclusively on foot through forced marches that constituted in themselves part of the psychological terror process. Each column included between 20 and 100 people according to the operational capacity of the moment and the availability of escort personnel. The marches lasted between 15 minutes and 2 hours, depending on the distance to execution sites, backyards of military installations, abandoned barracks and wooded areas on the outskirts of Lviv, particularly the Vinnytsia forest. Execution sites had been previously prepared through the excavation of collective ditches that took advantage of the natural topography of the terrain. Upon arriving at the site, a specific protocol developed to maximize efficiency was applied. Victims were forced to partially undress and form lines in front of the excavations. They were made to walk to the edge of each ditch, which measured between 5 and 15 meters in length according to the number of victims anticipated for each operation. Executions were carried out through shots to the nape with Walter P.38 pistols for precision in individual cases, or from rear positions using Kar-98K rifles for groups organized in rows. In cases of large groups that required rapid processing, MG-34 machine guns were employed to accelerate the process and maintain operational schedules. Burial was immediate. Specific shifts were assigned to cover each round of executed with earth or quicklime before proceeding with the next group. Executions were organized at intervals of 30 to 60 minutes according to the size of each group and terrain conditions at each specific site. A standard team of 10 executors could eliminate up to 150 people in a 10-hour workday, according to operational data recovered from Einsatzgruppen. This pace was maintained through rotating shifts that allowed continuous operations throughout the entire cleaning period of the city. German personnel established programmed breaks to avoid fatigue that could affect the precision of shots or the general efficiency of the process. Functions between shooting, perimeter surveillance, and burial tasks were rotated to maintain troop morale and avoid psychological exhaustion that could reduce operational effectiveness. Reports from the Sicherheitsdienst and Wehrmacht indicate that between June 30th and July 15th, 1941, between 6,000 and 8,000 people were executed in Lviv and its immediate surroundings. The distribution by categories included approximately 4,000 Jewish males, more than 1,000 former Soviet officials, and about 500 priests, professors, and public figures identified as potential future resistance leaders. The armament employed reflects the systematic nature of the operations and the prior planning of execution methods. Kar-98K rifles were used by shooters organized in squads for executions of medium groups that required precision and efficiency. Walter P-38 and Luger P-08 pistols were reserved for short-range executions and individual cases that required discretion. MG-34 machine guns were employed in the Vinnytsia forest to accelerate the process when large groups of victims accumulated awaiting execution. The average execution time for a group of 50 victims was between 20 and 30 minutes, including formation, shooting, and immediate burial. Efficiency was maintained during complete workdays, which allowed a daily elimination capacity superior to 1,000 people if the operation functioned without significant interruptions due to logistical or personnel problems. Logistical coordination required continuous supply of ammunition, excavation tools, and transport for executing personnel between different sites in the city. German supply services established temporary supply deposits at strategic points to avoid delays that could interrupt programmed operations. Palmiry, the secret executions of Polish intelligence. In the silent forests northwest of Warsaw, German authorities established one of the most systematic and selective elimination centers of the Nazi occupation in Eastern Europe. The Palmiry forest, located approximately 30 kilometers from the Polish capital, became the execution site for the intellectual and organizational elite of Polish society through a process that combined previously elaborated blacklists with meticulously organized extrajudicial elimination protocols. The victims of Palmiry were not randomly selected during the occupation. Their names appeared in the Sonderfahndungsbuch Polen, a compendium of approximately 61,000 people pre-identified by the Gestapo and Sicherheitsdienst even before the invasion of Poland. These lists catalogued Polish public figures as potential resistance elements or intellectually dangerous, according to the racial and political criteria of the Nazi regime. After the occupation of Warsaw in September 1939, these lists were reactivated under supervision of SS Oberführer Karl Eberhard Schöngarth, Sicherheitsdienst delegate in the general government. Starting in March 1940, the elimination process was institutionalized through the AB Action, the Extraordinary Pacification Action. This directive aimed to selectively eliminate the intellectual and organizational elite of Polish society in zones under direct German administration. Arrest orders were drafted by local Gestapo units in coordination with Sicherheitsdienst district chiefs. Transfer and execution were planned with logistical support from the Schutzpolizei through weekly cycles that allowed processing large groups of detainees without interruptions in the general administration of the occupation. The process followed a specific administrative protocol designed to maximize efficiency and minimize possibilities of resistance or escape. Victims were arrested in their homes, workplaces, or during routine controls in Warsaw. Formal accusations included illegal propaganda, collaboration with the Polish General Staff in exile, or simply appearing on the blacklists prepared before the war. Arrest orders did not require specific evidence or judicial procedures. Prisoners were transferred to Pawiak, Warsaw's central political prison, where they were kept incommunicado during periods ranging from 1 week to several months. Access to the identity and number of detainees was restricted even for other inmates, creating a system of controlled disappearance that made it difficult to track individual cases by families or organizations. Transport to the execution site was carried out exclusively during the night using closed trucks, generally requisitioned from the Wehrmacht to avoid public observation and maintain operational secrecy. Transfers were officially disguised as transfers between prisons or labor deportations, deceptions that facilitated logistical control without arousing suspicions among personnel not directly involved in the operations. In the Palmiry forest, common graves had already been excavated by forced labor teams before each operation. Victims were forced to walk in line toward the ditches under escort by members of the Sicherheitsdienst and Ordnungspolizei. No final words or ceremonies were allowed. The process was designed to maximize efficiency and minimize exposure time for executing personnel. Executions were carried out through shots from behind, using individual pistol shots with Walter or controlled bursts from MP-38 submachine guns according to group size. Bodies were buried immediately without identification or markers, eliminating any possibility of subsequent location by family members. SS personnel recorded the exact number of executed per workday, but rarely documented specific names to maintain victim anonymity. Consolidated analysis of German, Polish, and Soviet records after the war establishes that at least 1,700 people were executed in Palmiry between December 1939 and July 1941. The operational pace can be divided into 3 distinct phases according to the intensity and specific objectives of each period. Between December 1939 and March 1940, executions were sporadic, processing groups of between 10 and 20 prisoners according to the availability of immediate targets and the logistical capacity of the moment. This initial phase served mainly to eliminate public figures who had been identified as immediate threats to the establishment of German administration. The period from April to June 1940 coincided with the intensive implementation of the AB action, constituting the operational peak of executions in Palmiry. During this phase, up to 200 people per week were executed in groups of between 40 and 70 victims, systematically processing the blacklists prepared before the war. This intensification responded to specific directives from Heinrich Himmler to accelerate the elimination of Polish intellectuality. From July 1940 to July 1941, operations continued as residual elimination of specific targets, executing between 10 and 30 individuals per operation as new cases appeared or pending investigations were completed. This final phase concentrated on figures who had managed to avoid initial detention or who had been identified subsequently through Gestapo investigations. One of the most documented days was June 20, 1940, when 358 people were executed in a single workday, including senators, deputies, university professors, and Polish army officers. This figure was confirmed by documents found in the Warsaw Sicherheitsdienst archives, where the workday was officially recorded as successfully closed according to established objectives. The main documents that support the Palmiry executions include the order from General Governor Hans Frank of April 1940 authorizing the implementation of the AB action as a preventive security measure, Pauiak prisoner entry and exit records where programmed emptying is observed on dates coinciding with executions. Internal Sicherheitsdienst reports recovered after the war containing partial counts and elimination orders signed by district SS officers. The Soviet exhumation report carried out between 1945 and 1946 documented the finding of at least 24 common graves in the Palmiry area, with records of 1,720 bodies, many with tied hands and evidence of shots to the nape. This forensic report provided physical validation of German administrative figures and confirmed the execution methods employed. The Palmiry executions were recognized as war crimes by the Warsaw Polish courts and by the Soviet State Commission for the Investigation of Fascist Crimes. Documentary and forensic evidence was used in the Krakow processes and in the Nuremberg trials, establishing legal precedents for the classification of intellectual elite elimination as a crime against humanity. Unlike concentration camps, where murders frequently resulted from forced labor, hunger, or executions within the established penitentiary system, Palmiry functioned exclusively as a center for secret extrajudicial elimination. Victims were intellectual elites pre-selected according to specific political criteria, not prisoners classified according to general criminal or racial categories. The site operated in remote forests without permanent structures, while camps functioned as fenced complexes with administrative infrastructure. The methods employed were limited to shooting in prepared ditches, avoiding the variety of techniques used in penitentiary installations. The level of concealment was maximum without identifying marks or medical records, contrasting with the partial documentation maintained in concentration camps. Personnel participation was limited to the Sicherheitsdienst, Gestapo, and Ordnungspolizei, units specialized in secret operations, while camps employed Totenkopfverbände and regular penitentiary administration. This differentiation demonstrates that Palmiry constituted a specialized operation, not a byproduct of the general prison system. but an independent elimination mechanism with specific administrative objectives within the Germanization policy of occupied territories. The legacy of Palmiry illustrates the capacity of the Nazi regime to combine prior planning, administrative precision, and systematic brutality in operations designed to intellectually decapitate occupied societies. The elimination of educational and organizational elites constituted a fundamental strategy to prevent the formation of effective resistance structures. Lidice, the execution of the entire village as punishment. In the hills of Bohemia, 20 kilometers from Prague, one of the most systematically documented reprisals of the Nazi regime developed: the complete elimination of a community as collective punishment for an act of resistance. The village of Lidice was selected to demonstrate the consequences of any opposition to German control in occupied territories, establishing a precedent of terror that would resonate throughout the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. On May 27, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Central Security Office and deputy protector of the Protectorate, was attacked in Prague by members of the Czechoslovak resistance movement trained by the British Special Operations Executive. The attack was part of Operation Anthropoid, designed to eliminate one of the principal architects of Nazi genocide and destabilize German administration in Czechoslovakia. Heydrich died on June 4, 1942, from sepsis caused by metallic and textile fragments introduced into his organism during the explosion. His death unleashed a wave of reprisals planned from Berlin under direct supervision of Heinrich Himmler and the SS General Staff. The objective was to demonstrate the absolute control of the Third Reich over occupied territories and eradicate any future local support for resistance through an example of extreme brutality. Lidice was selected as a target not because of direct evidence of participation in the attack against Heydrich, but as a calculated symbolic punishment to impact the entire Czech population. The official pretext was an intercepted letter that falsely linked village residents to the authors of the attack, a document that subsequent investigations demonstrated had been fabricated by the Gestapo to justify the operation. The operation was ordered by Karl Hermann Frank, Secretary of State of the Protectorate and SS Obergruppenführer, and Kurt Daluege, Heydrich's interim successor as protector. Execution was carried out by combined units of the Gestapo, Sicherheitsdienst and Ordnungspolizei personnel under direct SS coordination. The plan was approved without judicial investigation or administrative procedures, constituting a direct extermination order. Frank officially declared that the operation aimed to annihilate all men, disperse the women, and liquidate or Germanize the children in compliance with directives transmitted from Berlin by Himmler. This formulation demonstrated that the destruction of Lidice was part of broader policies of demographic elimination and racial restructuring of occupied territories. On June 9, 1942, Gestapo and German police units mobilized toward Lidice with complete equipment for a multi-day operation. The deployment included personnel specialized in demolitions, excavation equipment, and vehicles for mass transport of people and materials. On June 10th at 4 a.m, the village was completely surrounded by more than 100 armed personnel, blocking all entry and exit routes to prevent escapes or external interference during the operation. Between 6 and 7 a.m, the population was systematically separated by sex and age through procedures developed specifically for this operation. All men over 15 years old were retained in Horak's stable, an agricultural structure near the village center that had been previously selected for its capacity and location. Simultaneously, women and children were loaded into requisitioned trucks and transferred toward Kladno for interrogation, classification, and subsequent deportation. The execution of men began at 9 a.m. and continued until 5 p.m. in an operation that combined administrative efficiency with systematic brutality. The 173 men were shot in groups of 5 in front of a stable wall that had been reinforced with mattresses to avoid bullet ricochets and facilitate subsequent cleanup. The procedure followed an invariable sequence that was maintained throughout the entire workday. Each group of 5 victims was aligned 2 meters from the execution wall under direct supervision of SS officers. They fired at close range using Mauser Kar 98K rifles to guarantee immediate death and minimize prolonged suffering. In cases where some victim survived the first shot, he was immediately finished off with a Walther P. 38 pistol. Each series lasted approximately 5 minutes, including firing squad change and body removal. Corpses were immediately thrown into a common grave excavated previously near the execution site. At the end of the operation, all bodies were sprayed with quicklime and buried without individual identification or markers that would allow subsequent location. The execution pace remained constant during 8 consecutive hours, completing the elimination of all village men before nightfall. The 203 women were sent directly to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where the majority was used as forced labor in textile and munitions factories. Camp conditions and exhausting work caused the death of a significant proportion of these women during the subsequent war years. The 105 children were initially housed in Kladno facilities under Gestapo custody for racial evaluation and classification according to criteria established by the Race and Settlement Main Office. Subsequently, 82 were deported to extermination camps, especially Chelmno, where they were murdered through exhaust gases in sealed trucks or died from hunger and diseases in deliberately lethal conditions. 17 children considered racially suitable according to Russia criteria were Germanized, sent to selected German families to be re-educated under completely new identities. These children lost all contact with their Czech origin and were raised as ethnic Germans. 6 additional children died during the classification and transfer process due to the brutal conditions of transport and confinement. These transfers were executed under direct supervision of the Russia and meticulously recorded in Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia archives. Documents included photographs, anthropometric measurements, and racial evaluations of each child, demonstrating the systematic and bureaucratic nature of the forced Germanization process. The main documents that support this operation include the telegram signed by Karl Hermann Frank on June 9, 1942, ordering the immediate disappearance of the village of Lidice, the Prague Sicherheitsdienst report confirming the shooting of 173 men and the deportation of women and children, Ravensbrück admission lists where 203 women are recorded with entry date of June 12. Russia records contain detailed notes about children selected for Germanization and their new destinations in German families. Gestapo field reports include specific orders to destroy all houses and completely level the terrain. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aerial photographs show the village before and after its demolition, providing visual evidence of the scope of destruction. Physical destruction of the village began immediately after executions as an integral part of the operation. All houses were dynamited between June 11th and 12th using military explosives that guaranteed complete demolition of structures. The cemetery was systematically profaned and bodies exhumed to eliminate any vestige of the site's history. The village church was blown up along with its bell tower, eliminating the most visible reference point of the community. No structure was allowed to remain standing. The terrain was subsequently ploughed and sown with barley to eliminate physical traces of the former village location and create the illusion that a community had never existed in that place. The explicit objective was to eliminate all physical and demographic vestiges of the locality, establishing a precedent that entire communities could be erased from existence as a consequence of resistance acts. This collective reprisal policy was designed to discourage any future support for resistance movements in occupied territories. All these documents were presented as evidence in the Nuremberg trials and in the Czechoslovak National Tribunal of 1946, establishing Lidice as a paradigmatic example of crime against humanity through collective reprisal. The operation demonstrated the capacity of the Nazi regime to implement genocides on a community scale with administrative efficiency and systematic brutality. The destruction of Lidice constituted an operational model that combined immediate physical elimination with complete historical erasure, a technique that would be considered subsequently by international tribunals as a specific form of cultural genocide. The meticulous German documentation of the entire process provided irrefutable evidence of the premeditated and systematic nature of these crimes against civilian populations. The Lidice case also illustrates the evolution of Nazi policies from selective murder toward total elimination of communities as an instrument of political terror. The operation demonstrated that the regime was willing to sacrifice entire populations to maintain control over occupied territories and discourage any form of organized resistance.